Welcome back to Naked History, the podcast where we dig up the stories of history, dust them off, and sometimes find they still got a little grave dirt underneath the fingernails. And today, we're not just digging, we're walking straight into America's most infamous haunting, the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. Now, the word Salem has become shorthand for paranoia, hysteria, and the dangers of mass panic. It's the name Hollywood trots out when they need witches, pitchforks, or just an excuse to put Winona Ryder in colonial chic. But the real story? It's far stranger and far darker than anything on screen. This one's going to be a little bit of a long one, so over the course of the episode, we're going to walk step by step through the events of Salem, the people, the accusations, the trials, the gallows, and the aftermath. You'll meet the ministers who fanned the flames, the judges who signed the death warrants, and the women and men who stood on the scaffold, and even the governor who tried to slam on the brakes after his own wife got named a witch. But before we dive into gallows and ghosts, we need to understand the world of Salem. So let's start at the beginning, with the worldview that made witchcraft the ultimate crime. Let's get into it. To understand Salem, you've got to get inside the head of the Puritans. New England in the 1690s was not a land of religious freedom, at least not in the way that we think about it. The Puritans had fled England to practice their own brand of strict Calvinism, not to host a multi-faith potluck. They believed that they were God's chosen people, carving out a city upon a hill in the wilderness. And their covenant with God was absolute, and if they failed, they believed God would punish their entire community. Now, in this worldview, the devil wasn't just a metaphor, he was a real, active, and prowling around Massachusetts like a wolf looking for prey. Witches weren't quirky herb women or misunderstood healers, they were traitors to God. People who had signed a pact with Satan himself, working to destroy the colony from within. So when something went wrong, a failed crop, a sudden illness, or a cow keeling over in the field, the Puritans didn't just mutter, oh, that's a stroke of bad luck. They looked specifically for the devil's fingerprints. And if the devil had fingerprints, witches were his hands. By 1692, Salem Village was primed for crisis. The village had split factions. Some supported Reverend Samuel Parris, their minister, and others despised him. The frontier war with native peoples had left scars, and refugees from Maine were crowding into towns. Crops had failed, wolves prowled, and fear ran thick. All it needed was a spark. Enter Reverend Samuel Parris. Born in Barbados to a plantation family, Parris inherited enslaved people and sugar wealth before moving to Boston. He married into prominent families, dabbled unsuccessfully in business, and finally took up the pulpit in Salem Village in 1689. But Parris wasn't a unifying figure. His sermons brimmed with warnings of conspiracy and Satan's plots. His demands for salary, firewood, and ownership of the personage alienated half of the congregation. He also brought with him enslaved members of his household, including Tituba, her husband John Indian, and their daughter Violet. They lived under Parris's roof, carrying with them Caribbean culture influences that would play directly into the crisis. In January of 1692, Parris's daughter Betty, age 9, and his niece Abigail Williams, age 11, began to have strange fits. They screamed, convulsed, hid under furniture, and shouted blasphemies. Doctors couldn't explain it, so naturally, the diagnosis was witchcraft. Picture it. You're a Puritan dad. Your child starts shrieking, throwing things, and hiding under the table. You don't call a child psychologist. You call the neighbors and say, yep, she's bewitched. Now, Parris, primed by years of preaching about Satan's assaults, leaned into the narrative. Soon, other girls in Salem began to exhibit the same fits. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and the village was off to the races. At the center of this eruption was Tituba. Unlike the Hollywood stereotype of the cackling white-haired crone, Tituba was an enslaved Kalina woman, originally from South America, who had been trafficked to Barbados and then into the Paris' household. She carried stories, rituals, and cultural practices from her background that fascinated the children of Salem. One of these was the infamous witch cake, a mixture of rye meal and urine from the afflicted girls, baked and fed to a dog in hopes that it would reveal the witch tormenting them. When this strange folk remedy came to light, suspicion immediately turned to Tituba. Under intense pressure and violent coercion from Reverend Paris himself, Tituba confessed. She admitted to practicing witchcraft, but her confession was far from simple. She claimed that there were witches in Salem, not just herself, but others working with the devil. She described visions of animals, specters, and a tall man in dark clothing, Satan himself. And that's when the trials exploded, because Tituba didn't just confess, she opened the door. She basically handed Salem a horror movie script and said, "There are monsters out there." Now, her confession legitimized the girl's fits to the people of the village and gave Salem leaders a clear villain. More importantly, she gave them names. Now, accusations spread, pointing fingers at other women in the village. Tituba had set the stage for mass hysteria, though under the circumstances where she had likely little choice but to comply. Her fate remains murky. She was imprisoned, later recanted her confession, and was eventually sold to cover jail fees. After that, Tituba vanishes from the record entirely. Now, if Tituba opened the door, the afflicted girls stormed through it. Foremost among them was Anne Putnam Jr., just 12 years old at the time, smart, dramatic, and tied to one of Salem Village's most powerful families, Anne became the ringleader of accusations. Alongside her was Mercy Lewis, a refugee from Maine whose traumatic childhood, losing her family in frontier raids, may have fueled her fervent visions. Now, together, Anne and Mercy drove the panic. They fell into fits during examinations, pointed out witches in the crowd, and spun elaborate stories of spectral torment. Their testimony carried extraordinary weight, shaping who was accused, tried, and condemned. Now imagine middle school theater kids with the power to decide who lives and who dies. That was basically Salem in 1692. Now later, Anne Putnam Jr. would be the only afflicted girl to publicly apologize. In 1706, she stood in church and confessed that she had been, quote, deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people. Mercy Lewis, by contrast, never recanted. Their partnership, one repentant and one silent, perfectly mirrors Salem itself. Half shame, half silence. When accusations flew, someone had to make them official. Enter Salem's magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Hathorne, born in 1641, was a prosperous merchant and militia officer with no formal legal training. But that didn't stop him from grilling accused witches like a Puritan bulldog. He interrogated Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne in March of 1692, pressing them aggressively to confess. Now, Hawthorne wasn't a neutral judge. He was a prosecutor in magistrate's clothing. Modern times, think of him as Judge Judy, if Judge Judy genuinely believed you might be the devil's intern. Now, alongside him was Jonathan Corwin, another prominent Salem figure, though quieter than Hawthorne, he lent legitimacy to the examinations. Together, the two men became known as the Salem Magistrates, the first layer of officialdom that transformed gossip into indictments. Now, Hawthorne never repented for his role, and his great-great-grandson, author Nathaniel Hawthorne, quietly added a W to the family name, perhaps to distance himself from the shame. Corwin, meanwhile, lived in a house that still stands today in Salem, known appropriately as the Witch House. Now, by spring of 1692, Salem was ablaze. Reverend Parris's household had produced the first strange fits. Tituba's coerced confession had validated fears. The afflicted girls, led by Anne Putnam and Mercy Lewis, were pointing fingers, and Hawthorne and Corwin were scribbling it all down, turning accusation into indictment. The machinery of hysteria was in motion, and soon the colony's highest leaders would step in. Governor Phipps, Chief Justice Stoughton, and Justice Sewell, giving the crisis its full institutional weight. Now, if Salem magistrates struck the match, then Governor William Phipps built the bonfire. Born in 1651 in Maine, William was the youngest of 26 children. That's not a typo in the script, 26 children. His father was a gunsmith, and little William grew up poor, uneducated, and working as a shepherd. But he had big ambitions. As a teenager, he walked to Boston, apprenticed as a ship carpenter, and eventually rose to captainships himself. Now, his life reads like a swashbuckling novel. In 1687, backed by investors, Phipps led a treasure-hunting expedition in the Bahamas. Against all odds, he salvaged the wrecks of Spanish galleons and returned with a fortune. For his success, the English crown knighted him. From illiterate farm boy to Sir William Phipps, not a bad transition for a kid from the backwoods. But by 1692, Phipps had become the first royal governor of Massachusetts. He arrived in Boston in May with a new charter granting the colony self-government. But there was a problem. No formal courts would be set up until October. In the meantime, witchcraft accusations were piling up in Salem, and something had to be done. So on May 27th of 1692, Phipps created a temporary special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine criminal cases of witchcraft. He appointed his Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton as Chief Justice. Alongside him sat Samuel Sewell, John Hathorne, Jonathan Corwin, and others. So basically, Phipps landed in Boston, saw the whole place was in panic mode, and said, "Fine, you get a special court, knock yourselves out." Like giving a toddler a chainsaw because they said blocks weren't cutting it. Now, by authorizing the court, Phipps legitimized Salem's hysteria. Within weeks, indictments poured in and trials were underway, and gallows were being built. Although later he'd rein it back in, spoiler alert, by then the damage was done. If Governor Phipps opened the door, William Stoughton slammed it shut behind him and bolted it. Stoughton was born in 1631 to a wealthy Massachusetts family. He studied theology at Harvard and Oxford, but never became a minister. Instead, he turned to politics. By the 1670s, he was serving as deputy president of the colony's government. By the 1690s, he was Chief Justice, despite having no legal training. And in Salem, that mattered, because Stoughton's lack of legal education meant he leaned on theology instead of jurisprudence. He allowed practices that horrify us today, admitting spectral evidence or visions, dreams, ghostly apparitions, letting accusers converse privately with judges, permitting spectators to cry out in the middle of examinations, denying defendants legal counsel. Now imagine, again, Judge Judy, but instead of "did you sign this lease," it's "did your neighbor's invisible specter claw you in the bed?" And she actually accepts that answer as evidence. That was Salem under Stoughton. Now, Stoughton presided over every major execution of 1692. He signed the death warrants of Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, and more. And he oversaw the pressing of Giles Corey. When Governor Phipps later ordered spectral evidence disallowed and reprieved some condemned prisoners, Stoughton was furious. He stormed off the bench in protest, angry that mercy had replaced judgment. Now, unlike Samuel Sewell, Stoughton never repented. He went on to serve as acting governor of Massachusetts. He died in 1701 with his reputation largely intact. Now, if Salem has a villain, it's Stoughton. a villain in robes, not because he twirled his mustache, but because he believed that he was doing God's work, and he never looked back. In contrast to him, Stoughton, the judge who never repented, Samuel Sewall is the judge who did. Born in England in 1652, Samuel Sewall immigrated to Massachusetts as a child, studied at Harvard, and married into wealth. By the 1690s, he was a prominent merchant and counselor, well-connected and respected. He sat alongside Stoughton and the court, participating in the trials and voting for executions. At the time, Sewall raised no objections. He believed in the reality of witchcraft and went along with the court. But the aftermath weighed on him. As doubts grew and the trials came under scrutiny, Sewall's conscience cracked. On January 14, 1697, during a public fast day, Sewall stood in Boston's Old South Meeting House and read a statement confessing his guilt. He begged God to pardon his errors in the trials, and from then on, he observed an annual day of fasting and prayer every January, mourning his role. So while Stoughton doubled down, Sewall basically invented the Puritan version of no-sap apology, except his was actually heartfelt. He lived with that guilt for the rest of his life. Now, Sewall's later career reflected his conscience. In 1700, he published The Selling of Joseph, the first anti-slavery tract in colonial America. It was a radical stance for his time, but if Stoughton represents zeal without mercy, Sewall represents conscience awakened. A reminder that even in the darkest times, some people can change. Two judges, side by side in 1692, hearing the same evidence, signing the same warrants, but their legacies couldn't be more different. It's Salem giving us a morality play in stereo. William Stoughton, rigid, unrepentant, convinced that he was a sword of God. He saw mercy as weakness and died believing he was right. On contrast, Samuel Sewall, complicit, guilty, but able to recognize his error, living with the rest of his life trying to atone. It's almost Shakespearean. Stoughton a zealot, Sewall a penitent. One eats dinner without regret, the other fasts every January in mourning. If Salem is a cautionary tale, these two judges are its twin masks. One tragedy, one hubris. Their contrast drives home the complexity of Salem. It wasn't just a simple story of villains and saints. It was a story of ordinary women and men swept up in fear, some digging in and some repenting, all of them leaving scars. And then came the first blood. Bridget Bishop was, by Puritan standards, scandalous. She owned a tavern, she wore colorful clothing, a red bodice scandalously bright against the drab browns and blacks of Salem. She quarreled with neighbors, rumors swirled that she held late-night gatherings and entertained shady company. In a community where conformity was survival, Bishop stuck out. When the afflicted girls accused her, the community was primed to believe it. She was arrested, examined, and indicted. In June of 1692, she stood trial before Stoughton's court. The girls convulsed in the courtroom, claiming her specter had attacked them. Neighbors testified to her temper and her tavern. The evidence was weak, but in Salem, weak evidence was enough. Bridget Bishop was convicted, and on June 10th of 1692, she was led to Gallows Hill and hanged, the first victim of the Salem Witch Trials. And with her death, the floodgates opened. Salem now had blood on its hands, and the court now had precedents. If Bridget Bishop could hang, so could anyone. Her execution shocked some, but for others, it confirmed the reality of witches. And in the weeks that followed, the noose would tighten again and again. By summer of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had transformed from local panic to full-blown institutional nightmare. Phipps had created the court, Stoughton had empowered it, Sewall had sat in uneasy silence, and Bridget Bishop swung as the first of 20 victims. The stage was set for Salem's bloodiest summer. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, John Proctor, George Burroughs were all waiting in the wings. And if you thought that one hanging surely would satisfy the hysteria, oh no. Salem was just getting warmed up. If you want to see how Salem treated its most vulnerable, look no further than Sarah Good. Sarah was poor, destitute, and homeless. Her father had killed himself when she was a child, and her family's land was stolen in the aftermath. She married twice, racked up debts, and spent her days begging at neighbors' doors. And when the Salem girls started pointing fingers, Sarah Good was an easy target. She was cranky, she muttered under her breath when denied charity, and she didn't exactly radiate Puritan piety. To Salem, that was enough to smell of witchcraft. She was among the first three accused in February of 1692, along with Sarah Osborne and Tituba. Unlike Osborne, who soon died in jail, and Tituba, who confessed under pressure, Sarah Good denied it all. Her trial was a spectacle. Neighbors testified she cursed them. A man waved a broken knife, claiming Sarah's specter snapped it in a fit of rage, until someone else pointed out it was just his own knife, broken days earlier. Even her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was imprisoned and pressured to accuse her own mother. On July 19th of 1692, Sarah Good was hanged. Her husband testified against her. Her child was traumatized in prison, but at the gallows, Sarah refused to break. When Reverend Nicholas urged her to confess, she cursed him instead, saying, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." And get this, years later, Reverend Nicholas reportedly died choking on his own blood. History has a dark sense of humor. Now, Sarah Good's story shows the cruelty of Salem. When panic struck, the poor, the voiceless, and the unwanted were the first to swing. If Sarah Good was Salem's scapegoat, Rebecca Nurse was its conscience. Rebecca was 71, frail and devout. She came from the respected town family and married into prosperity. By all accounts, she was pious, charitable, and beloved, which made her accusation a shock. In June of 1692, Rebecca was brought to trial. Hundreds signed petitions vouching for her character. The jury initially returned a not guilty verdict, but the afflicted girls howled. The court pressured the jury, and they reconsidered. A misunderstood comment, "What do these confess against me?" was twisted into evidence of guilt. The jury reversed itself. Rebecca was condemned, and on July 19th of 1692, she was hanged alongside Sarah Good. The execution horrified many in Salem. If Rebecca Nurse could be branded a witch, then truly no one was safe. And this was the turning point of the witch trials. When the community's saintliest grandma is on the gallows, you've gone too far. But by then, the machine was running, and no one knew how to stop it. Rebecca's family never forgot or forgave. Years later, they fought for her exoneration and received compensation. Today, her homestead in Danvers still stands, a haunting reminder of Salem's injustice. Rebecca Nurse wasn't the only town sister to suffer. Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce were also accused. Sarah Cloyce openly defended Rebecca. When she stormed out of church after hearing a sermon against witches, suspicion fell on her. She was arrested, imprisoned, and charged. Mary Easty was arrested, released, and then rearrested when the afflicted girls threw new fits in her presence. She maintained her innocence, writing a moving petition to the court begging them to not shed innocent blood. Her plea was ignored. On September 22nd of 1692, Mary Easty was hanged. Now, the Towns Sisters saga illustrates Salem's brutality. Rebecca, beloved, Mary, eloquent, and Sarah, outspoken. All accused, 2 executed. 1 left to live with the grief. It's like the Salem trials were running a family plan. Accuse 1 sibling, get 2 free. Hey. Now, if Rebecca Nurse was the conscience of Salem, John Proctor was its voice of dissent. Proctor was a farmer, tavern keeper, and known for his bluntness. When the hysteria broke out, he called the girls frauds and denounced the trials. And he wasn't subtle for this. He threatened to beat his servant Mary Warren when she joined the accusers. That outspokenness, however, made him a target. Soon, John, his wife Elizabeth, and several of his family members were accused, with Mary Warren turned against him under pressure. Proctor appealed to Boston ministers, writing letters begging for intervention and denouncing the use of spectral evidence, but it was too late. On August 19, 1692, John Proctor was hanged, protesting his innocence. Arthur Miller would later make him the star of the Crucible, turning him into a symbol of conscience against hysteria. But the real Proctor wasn't a tragic hero on stage. He was a farmer, furious and defiant, who went to his death calling the whole thing utter madness. And the trials didn't just pick off individuals, even though it's mostly what we talked about. Sometimes they've devoured entire households. Deliverance Hobbs, her husband William, and their daughter Abigail were all accused. Abigail was notorious for rebellious behavior, and she was among the first teens arrested. To save herself, she accused others, including her own parents. Deliverance initially denied the charges, but eventually broke down under interrogation, confessing and naming names, including Reverend George Burroughs as the leader of witches' meetings. William, by contrast, denied everything, but still spent months in jail. The Hobbs family shows how Salem's panic shattered homes. Confessions weren't just survival strategies, they were weapons used against your own kin. Salem was basically the original vote each other off the island game, except instead of losing a reality show, you lose your life. Now, within Salem, no figure loomed larger in the trials than Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs had once been a minister of Salem Village, but left under bitter disputes. By 1692, he was serving in Maine. The Putnam family, key driver of accusations, despised him. And soon, the girls accused him of being the ringleader of witches. Now, the charges were dramatic, to say the least. They said that he had superhuman strength, that he led secret Sabbaths, and that he consorted himself with the devil. He was arrested, tried, and condemned. On August 19th, in 1692, Burroughs was hanged alongside John Proctor. At the gallows, he did something extraordinary. He recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly. Now, supposedly, witches were incapable of it. The crowd gasped, and some called for his reprieve, but Sawton and the court pressed on. Burroughs was still executed. Now, picture this. The accused witch pulls off the ultimate mic drop, praying better than the ministers themselves, and they kill him anyway. If Salem had a what-if moment, this was it. Burroughs' execution remains one of the trial's most haunting injustices. Now, to round it all out, we finally come to the man of most everyone's imagination, Giles Corey, the most infamous death of Salem. Giles was 81, a tough old farmer with a history of quarrels. When he was accused, he refused to plead guilty or not guilty. Why? Well, because under the law, if he refused to enter a plea, his land wouldn't be confiscated from his heirs. So the court applied peine forte dure, or oppressing. Corey was stripped, laid in a pit, and heavy stones piled on his chest. He endured for 2 long, grueling days in agony, but refused to speak. His last recorded words were "more weight." On September 19th, 1692, Giles Corey was crushed to death. 3 days later, his wife Martha was hanged. And that, folks, is hardcore Puritan stubbornness. Refuse to play their game, die a legend, and leave your land in your kids' hands. Giles Corey basically hacked the legal system with his ribs. And his defiance became a turning point. Salem's hysteria had claimed an old man crushed under rocks, and many began to wonder what kind of justice this was. By the end of September 1692, Salem's gallows had claimed 19 lives, and one man had been pressed to death. Families were shattered, reputations destroyed, and children were orphaned. And yet the trials showed no signs of stopping. But cracks were forming. Executions of pillars like Rebecca Nurse and George Burroughs had rattled the community. The pressing of Giles Corey horrified many, and soon the panic would stretch too far. To wealthy merchants, respected ministers, and even the governor's own wife. But that's the thing about hysteria. Once it's rolling, you can't steer it. You just have to wait until it crashes. Until now, Salem's gallows had mostly claimed the poor, the quarrelsome, the outspoken, and the vulnerable, but as we had said, hysteria has no brakes, and eventually it hit the wealthy too. Meet Philip and Mary English. Philip was a prosperous French Huguenot merchant. By the 1690s, he'd controlled a fleet of trading ships, owned property, and was one of Salem's richest men. Mary came from an equally prominent family, and together they were the colonial equivalent of a power couple royalty. But wealth and prominence weren't shields, especially in 1690s Massachusetts. In April of 1692, Mary English was accused of witchcraft, soon followed by Philip. The Englishes had enemies. Philip was French-born, Anglican rather than Puritan, and had legal disputes with the Putnam family. Add a bit of xenophobia and greed, and suddenly the richest people in Salem were suspects. Now, unlike Sarah Good or Rebecca Nurse, the Englishes had resources. They were jailed in Boston rather than the squalid Salem jail. Philip was even allowed to walk the streets of Boston during the day. Eventually, with the help of allies like Minister Joshua Moody, the couple escaped custody and fled to New York. And that's how you know Salem was broken. When rich people start fleeing the colony because your justice system has gone bananas, the writing was on the wall. The Englishes survived, but when they returned after the trials ended, much of their property had been confiscated. Mary died shortly thereafter, and Philip lived until 1736, bitter but still wealthy. The story shows that no one was truly safe, not even Salem's elite. But by the late summer of 1692, the web of accusations had stretched far beyond Salem Village. Prominent citizens in Boston, respected ministers, and even the governor's own circle were being named. At one point, Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, was whispered about as being a witch. Other accusations touched high-ranking church leaders. When the hysteria threatened the colony's ruling class, suddenly, people in power began to rethink things. And doubts were spreading on the ground too. Ordinary Bostonians and even some ministers started questioning the use of spectral evidence. The idea that dreams and visions could prove guilt. Increase Mather, father of Cotton Mather, famously declared, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned." That roughly translated to, maybe let's not kill Grandma just because someone dreamed about her poking them with a knitting needle. Maybe. Now, after this, the tide was turning. The trials had gone from community purge to institutional embarrassment, and something had to give. By October of 1692, Governor William Phipps finally acted. Returning from a military campaign, he found the colony in complete chaos. The special court that he had created had executed 19 people, pressed one to death, and jailed over 100. Even his wife's name had been dragged into the mud. On October 29th of 1692, Phipps ordered the court of Oyer and Terminer dissolved. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in January of 1693. Crucially, this new court banned spectral evidence, and without it, most cases collapsed. By May of 1693, Phipps had pardoned the remaining accused. The witch trials were over. And of course, this is the Puritan version of, oops, my bad. Phipps basically said, okay guys, new rule, no more ghost testimony. And just like that, the execution stopped. If only he thought of saying that, 20 people earlier. But his intervention did save dozens more from the gallows, and it marked the beginning of Salem's long, painful reckoning. The trials ended, but the damage lingered. In the immediate aftermath, families demanded restitution. By 1711, the colony granted compensation to survivors and families of the executed, though not everyone received justice. The town sisters' families, the proctors, the nurses, and others fought for decades to clear their loved ones' names. Some figures never repented. Chief Justice Stoughton went to his grave convinced he'd done God's work. Reverend Parris was eventually ousted from Salem Village, despised by his congregation. Now others did repent. Judge Samuel Sewall publicly confessed his guilt, and in 1706, Ann Putnam Jr. stood in Salem's church and apologized for her role as an accuser, claiming she had been deluded by Satan. She lived out the rest of her days unmarried, caring for her orphan siblings. Salem's scars ran deep. For centuries, the trials haunted New England memory and turned Salem's ghosts into Gothic fiction. Today, Salem is a paradox. A city of witch museums, haunted house tours, and Halloween revelry, but also solemn memorials where the names of the dead are carved in stone. And maybe that's fitting. Salem is both carnival and cautionary tale, both ghost story and legal case study, both tragedy and dark comedy. Because at its heart, the Salem Witch Trials remind us of what happens when fear outruns reason, when gossip becomes evidence, when the courts trade justice for zeal, and when the devil we fear most isn't hiding in the woods, he's our own imagination. And so Salem's story ends where it began, with a community gripped in fear, ordinary people convinced the devil was hiding in their neighbors' kitchens, and courts willing to trade reason for panic. But let's just be honest, Salem isn't just a colonial ghost story, it's a mirror. Every age has its witch hunts. Sometimes they're literal, sometimes they're metaphorical. Sometimes it's Puritans peering into shadows for Satan's agents. Sometimes it's government scanning files for un-American activities. Sometimes it's a hashtag campaign that turns rumor into trial and trial into condemnation. Different costumes, but the same play. At its core, Salem shows us what happens when fear hijacks our system of trust. When evidence becomes optional, when accusation is enough, when institutions bend to hysteria instead of holding the line. And every time that happens, the vulnerable are the first to pay. The poor, like Sarah Good, the outspoken like John Proctor, and the outsider like Tituba. But Salem also shows us something else. The power of conscience. Think of Samuel Sewall, the judge who broke ranks and admitted his guilt. Think of Ann Putnam Jr., who stood before her church 14 years later and confessed that she had been deluded by Satan. Think of the families who fought to clear the names of the condemned. These moments matter. They remind us that even in an age of hysteria, some people can stop, look around, and say, "We're wrong." The question for us, 3 centuries later, is whether we'll do the same when fear comes knocking. When social media mobs demand quick condemnations, when headlines scream about enemies in our midst, when politicians point to scapegoats and say that is the problem, will we be Hawthorne doubling down on our judgment, or will we be Sewell, brave enough to admit our mistakes? Salem's gallows are long gone, but the impulses that built them, they're still very much there. Every whisper campaign, every rush to judgment, every time we let our fear outrun reason, that is Salem replaying in real time. So the next time someone casually drops the phrase witch hunt, remember this: those aren't just words. They were lives lost, families broken, a town scarred, and the lessons are still waiting for us to learn if we choose to. And that wraps up 40 plus minutes of Salem. By far, I think one of the longest episodes that we've done so far. And it's because this whole topic is just jam-packed with so many details. So if you've survived 40 plus minutes of Salem with me, you've rightly earned your History Nerd badge. Go ahead and follow Naked History on whatever podcast service you're listening on so you don't miss the next descent into madness. And don't forget to drop us a review, preferably with 5 stars and not spectral evidence. Trust me, it helps more curious weirdos stumble into our little coven here. If you really liked this episode, we go into equally a deep dive on the debrief for Salem, digging into other witch hunts from history, seeing if we have learned anything from Salem. Spoiler, we really haven't. So, in all love and all appreciation, October is going to be the month of spooky. This one and the next one are going to delve into some deep lore about the spookiest season of the year. So this has been Naked History. I'm Dylan Gassaway, and thanks for walking with me through the ghosts of Salem. Share this podcast with all of your favorite witches and warlocks, and we'll see if we can't drum up another equally long episode for you for spooky season. And always remember, until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that we invent ourselves. Have a good one.